we announced the death of Sir Winston Churchill. The announcement came from 28 Hyde Park Gate a few minutes ago. It said that Sir Winston died shortly after 8 o'clock this morning.
Here in the Soviet Union, the Soviet government is sending condolences to Sir Winston's family and to the British government.
Australian regard for Churchill's sheer greatness, courage and vision as wartime leader and post-war prophet.
In accordance with the tradition of state funerals, Churchill's body was placed on a catafalque in Westminster Hall. He would lie in state for 3 days before the funeral. Over 300,000 people came to pay their respects.
My mother said, you know, from the moment his coffin left Hyde Park Gate to come here to lie in state, she said to us, he doesn't belong to us anymore. He belongs to the nation.
It was, above all, intensely moving. I suppose principally because I'd known him. I felt a very close connection there, but also it was the grandeur and the ceremony of Westminster Hall with the soldiers with their arms round the coffin. I went many times just to pay my respects.
The people waiting tried to keep warm by stamping their feet, huddling ever closer into their overcoats and scarves and blankets. Some of them had to wait 2.5 hours. Later, a few snow...
Reporting for the BBC was a young journalist, Martin Bell.
I just described the size of the crowd and the quietness and the sense of purpose, and they were going to stay there for as long as it took.
What was it that they were turning out for? Obviously it was a funeral, but was it something more than that?
I think they were turning out because they recognized the passing of someone very special in the life of the nation. I don't think the sort of revisionist historians had really chipped in by then, and I think people have probably forgotten the wilderness years and the errors of judgment and all the things that now are in every history. We just remembered the passing of a very great man, and this was the last time to pay tribute to him. I would have thought that event, the funeral, the lying in state, the great crowds, they represented the passing of the old Britain.
General, salute! Present! Fight!
On the 30th of January 1965, the coffin of the man who had led Britain through the war emerged from Westminster Hall. 7,000 servicemen waited for the start of the biggest procession London had witnessed since the Queen's coronation 12 years earlier. Commanding the bearer party carrying the coffin was a young lieutenant, Anthony Mather.
The bearer party consists of 8 bearers, with the tallest at the rear and the shortest in the front. And on this occasion, because it was a state occasion, there was a warrant officer in front, and I was bringing up the rear, giving the words of command and encouraging them to do as they were trained to do.
Among the bearers was Lance Sergeant Lincoln Perkins. The guardsmen were astonished by the weight of the burden on their shoulders.
The coffin, we were led to believe by the undertakers, was lead-lined. We all said, wow, we've not practiced with a weight like this before. It was just a surprise that he was so heavy.
There have been funeral processions before. There have been state funerals of...
Narrating the television coverage for the BBC was the veteran broadcaster Richard Dimbleby.
There has not been, I think, in the whole history of our land, a state funeral or an occasion which has touched the hearts of people quite as much as this one is doing today.
At 9:45, Big Ben chimed to mark the start of the procession to St. Paul's. The bell would remain silent for the rest of the day. There had been 7 years of planning beforehand. The state funeral was organised in 6 days.
I marched behind the coffin with my father and my younger brother Jeremy. And I always remember Jeremy was 12, I think, and he was the only one who didn't wear a top hat. He wasn't old enough to wear a top hat. And it was a freezing cold day, and I thought he must have frozen alive.
Strangely enough, you are very focused on what is going on in front of you, and your eyes are not swiveling around, seeing too much. But it was patently obvious that every side of the road, the crowds were 10, 12 deep, very sombre and very respectful of the coffin as it passed them.
Just marching down Whitehall, you saw these extraordinary faces. I mean, I've never seen such collective grief. And of course, people 10, 20 deep on the pavement the whole way. I mean, it was just sort of heartbreaking, really. It was just so moving.
My sister and I were sitting in the carriage together, and you could practically touch the people if you'd wanted to, and you could see their faces. I mean, it was extraordinary. I mean, you could see the tears pouring down their faces. You could see, I mean, the emotion that we saw on that journey, I mean, it was true, raw emotion. And I mean, not just tears trickling, I mean, really, with real anguish on their faces.
Over 3,000 people had been invited to St. Paul's for the funeral service. 111 countries would be represented, including 5 monarchs, 6 heads of state, and 16 prime ministers. The family wanted the funeral to have as personal a feel as possible. So a seat was found for the woman who baked Churchill's birthday cake every year, another for Odette Paul Roger, the woman whose company had made so much of the many gallons of champagne that Churchill had drunk, and another, because he enjoyed building brick walls at Chartwell and carried a Union card, for a representative of the National Union of Bricklayers. Churchill wasn't just Britain's hero. International statesmen, like former President Eisenhower and President de Gaulle, came too, recognizing Churchill's role in saving the Western world and democracy. Churchill's comrades from the country's finest hour tottered in too. The politicians who'd schemed and dreamed that one day they'd replace him, and the unlucky ones who did and were found wanting. The hour had made the man, and the hour, thank God, has not come again.
It was from this bunker deep beneath the streets of London that Churchill commanded armies, navies and aircrew all over the world. It was decisions made here and implemented here that determined the future of the world. When those dignitaries processed into St. Paul's Cathedral in January 1965, they were paying tribute to the leadership of this country at a time when the rest of the world critically depended upon it. But have the events of the early 1940s ever really been forgotten? When we venerate Churchill, do we, in a sense, expect to maintain forever the position at the top of international affairs as we had when he was Prime Minister?
Doesn't he represent an idea of Britain in the world that is actually profoundly unhelpful?
Actually, I think that Churchill's vision of Britain's role in the world is the most valid and useful guide for how we should think of ourselves. He wanted, obviously, Britain to have a close relationship with the former imperial countries of the Commonwealth, sure. But he also thought that Britain should be deeply intertwined with the United States, but he also thought that it was our destiny to be involved in what took place in Europe. Winston Churchill was one of the founders of the idea of the European Union. He was one of the great campaigners. And that vision of Britain as the centre of these three interconnecting sets, Europe, the Commonwealth, America, that's still a very powerful and attractive vision of how this country ought to position ourselves.
Back again at St Paul's Cathedral in a moment, we shall see the first arrival of members of our own royal family. The Queen, with her, the Prince of Wales, who has come from school at Gordonston for this day, and of course His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, in his uniform as Admiral of the Fleet, passing the gorgeous tabards of the heralds, the darker greatcoats of the household cavalry.
The bearer party, now carrying the coffin from the gun carriage to the cathedral, were about to face potentially huge public embarrassment.
We had difficulties occasionally, particularly on the steps of St Paul's. That was really the worst time. And we brought in on that occasion 2 swingmen at the back who helped to keep it steady on the shoulders, so not letting it slip downwards.
Just ahead of the bearer party was Lord Attlee, the former Labour Prime Minister, who'd insisted on attending the funeral against medical advice.
Halfway up the second flight of stairs, when Lord Attlee stumbled.
This is what, going into St Paul's?
Yes, going into St Paul's, and we had to come to a stop. And it did actually slide off the 2 front shoulders of the 2 bearers. And we was very lucky that we got the 2 gentlemen at the back who were pushers, what we call pushers, who push us up.
What went through your mind?
I'll tell it, Sir Richard Churchill, don't worry, sir, we'll look after you. Of course, I was really talking to myself, but apparently I was talking out loud, because you could actually feel him sliding off the shoulders. If we had dropped him, we'd have been, I don't know what would have been, very embarrassing, but we didn't.
And in a huge oaken coffin, surmounted by Union Jack, the body, Winston Churchill, is borne for his funeral service into the great Mother Church of the Commonwealth.
High up in the cathedral that morning was the St Paul's bell ringer, Jim Phillips.
We went up into the ringing chamber where we ring the bells, made ourselves comfortable, and then we went along the triforium to a gallery under the dome to watch the funeral from there. And it was quite interesting. We passed a garden shed, and it was dear old Richard Dimbleby in this garden shed doing the commentary from there.
So the setting is complete as the sentences come towards their end.
The service it wasn't harrowing, because it was just magnificent, really.
It was very, very moving and overwhelming, these great hymns. It was so grand, but it was also so personal. There was Winston Churchill in his coffin, and he was with us. I mean, there was a great sense of his presence at the ceremony.
Brethren, we are assembled here to join in prayer on the occasion of the burial of a great man who has rendered memorable service to his country and to the cause of freedom.
Of course one cried, I suppose, but we were swept along on this sort of tidal wave of splendour and splendid grief. The most wonderful, wonderful music I've ever heard anywhere in my entire life. And when the last post was played, I mean, you know, there wasn't a person in that, in St Paul's Cathedral who wasn't just standing bolt upright. It was just extraordinary.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Nice to see you. Thank you for coming. How does it feel to be back?
Well, yes, it's all coming back, actually.
There were two trumpeters playing at the funeral that day.
Yeah, for what I can remember, anyway.
Peter Wilson and Basil King haven't seen each other in 50 years since playing together here at St Paul's. Did you feel this was a special occasion?
Oh, this was definitely special. Definitely special.
Did you get a sense you were being part of history?
No, I didn't. No. All I was worried about was my knocking knees.
After Peter had finished the last post, Basil answered with Reveille.
It's the very easiest thing in the world to crack a note playing these type of trumpets, as people say, isn't it? It's easy to crack a note on there. Easy. And his was superb. And I thought, well, mine's got to be exactly the same. So I think I fixed my eye on something on the wall and got the nod to go, and there it was. It went very well, thankfully.
There were lots of people in the congregation that day among the mourners, particularly family members, who cried when they heard you two play. Did you get any sense of how people were reacting to hearing you play?
The last post always gets them, doesn't it, really? You know, it doesn't matter where you are or what funeral, the last post, they start to cry, yeah.
The muffled bells of St Paul's, rung by the ancient society of college youths, the bell ringers of the cathedral, ring out now high above the church over London.
Oh, it was tense, very tense. It was an atmosphere of sadness. This great man had gone. And when we pulled the bells off to peal them, every sinew and muscle was strained, and my legs were shaking, and the world was listening to us. The focus was on St Paul's at that particular hour. It was one of those things we had to do for the man, and I think we did it very well.
From St Paul's, the gun carriage travelled to Tower Bridge, where the man who'd been First Lord of the Admiralty in 2 world wars was carried onto the Haven Gore, a Port of London Authority launch now waiting at Tower Pier. The state funeral was about to end, and the private ceremony for the family would shortly begin. River traffic on the Thames had been stopped for an hour as the Havengore pulled out and headed upstream.
What was the Havengore's role in the funeral?
Well, this was the final part of the state funeral. It was moving the coffin from Tower Pier up the river to Waterloo Station, a journey of some sort of 15-20 minutes.
And this, as the plaque says, is where the coffin was.
That's right.
Was the coffin alone on the boat?
No, there was a bearer party to obviously carry the coffin on board and off. There was also the chief mourners, so that was Lady Churchill and the immediate members of her family in this cabin here.
Above the Havengore that day, as if from nowhere, roared 16 Lightning aircraft, a tribute from RAF Fighter Command.
Of the many emotional scenes on that charged day, one sight which really stuck in the minds of those who saw it was the spectacle of the cranes of the Port of London lowering their jibs as the barge passed. It seemed a spontaneous gesture of respect from a people in a part of Britain that had really suffered from Hitler's bombers during the Blitz.
We were all undone by the cranes dipping in salute to his coffin. That was just, I mean, that undid us all, really.
What an emotional sight that was, to finish off. So everybody's paying their respects by doing a half-mast crane. Amazing sight. Marvellous. Tear to the eye.
Those Thames cranes have long since gone, but one of the workers from the time remembers the docker's gesture somewhat differently.
You know the scene at the funeral when the dock cranes lower their jibs?
Yeah.
Talk to anyone who watched the television coverage in particular. That's the thing they remember.
Yeah.
And they all found it very, very moving.
Yeah. Mm.
Do you find it moving?
Not really, because I knew what happened.
What had happened?
They didn't like Churchill. Well, I'd say they didn't like him. I think I can speak for most of them. They didn't like him. And when they were asked to do it, the atmosphere was no. But then when they were paid to do it, because we didn't work Saturday afternoons, they wouldn't have been there.
So that was not a spontaneous gesture
No
of...
way. No way.
They were paid to do it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What was the feeling among the dockers about the men who were prepared to operate the cranes then?
I know that there was a lot of arguments and rows about it, and the atmosphere seemed to be, or the attitude seemed to be, if you respected the man, you'd have done it for nothing. If you didn't respect him, you shouldn't have done it at all. The atmosphere was that Churchill wasn't a working class person, he wasn't a working man's representative at all, absolutely. I mean, I remember going to school with holes in my shoes and bits of cardboard in it, and we used to see him with a great big cigar in one end, sometimes a drink in the other. He just didn't associate with us at all.
But it was a very moving gesture.
It was, yeah.
Were you moved by it?
I was, to be honest, I was. Or even though, you know...
You didn't like Churchill?
No, I didn't like
Churchill.
Churchill.
You were moved by the gesture?
I was moved by that, yeah. I was moved by the whole funeral. But I didn't like him at all.
Churchill had certainly been no friend of militant trade unionism and had even sent in the army against strikers. But he had led the fight against German fascism. Churchill's coffin would leave London by train on the next stage of the journey towards the small Oxfordshire churchyard, where he was to be buried that afternoon. Appropriately, the engine chosen to pull the funeral train was a steam locomotive from an earlier era. It was named Winston Churchill. The engine has been restored by a group of railway buffs in Hampshire to mark the anniversary of Churchill's death. At Waterloo Station, a new bearer party, made up of soldiers from Churchill's old cavalry regiment, bore his coffin onto the train waiting at platform 11. Just after 1:30 in the afternoon, the funeral train and mourners pulled out. It was the start of a 70-mile journey which would take 2 hours to reach the tiny station of Hamborough, close to the churchyard at Blaydon.
The moment that we left Waterloo, we saw so many people, thousands and thousands of people along the line, you know, in some of the strangest places, even in the countryside. They were in the fields, all along the line. And that was the most telling thing I felt personally about it. But the other thing was all the old soldiers, all in their battle dress, saluting as that train went by. Quite something. Never forget that.
I remember going down in the train to Blaydon. There was a lockkeeper, I remember, with all his medals up, standing there saluting.
At Blaydon, they had been preparing for the burial from the moment 6 days earlier when they first received news of Churchill's death. The passing of a historic figure merited an ancient village rite.
When you heard the news, you came across to the church and tolled the bell. Why did you do that?
Well, it used to be the old-fashioned way that when anybody passed away in the village, you used to go and toll the bell, and you used to toll the bell 3 threes for a man and 2 threes for a lady. And anybody in the village then knew that somebody had passed away, and it was either a man or a lady.
And so was it that because you thought that Churchill belonged to the village, or what?
Well, I thought it was a respect to let people know that Winston had died, you know, because we always knew that he was going to be buried here, because that's what he always said he was coming back to with his mother and father.
For the day of the funeral, Lady Churchill had asked for the press and cameras to keep away from Blaydon. Only villagers were allowed to witness the arrival of the coffin for the private burial.
Now, where's this picture? This must be one of the very last photographs taken at the funeral.
That was right here where we're standing. That is there, because there's a house there.
Here's the coffin coming down.
Yeah, it came down here and stopped here. Yeah.
So what, it's taken from that window up there?
Taken from that window, and this is the wall that's coming down here.
This is the coffin actually going into the churchyard, isn't it?
That's right, that's right. I don't know how I got them, but different people used to give you different photographs.
And then these little photographs here, these tiny, tiny ones, these must be the last photographs of the lot, I suppose.
That's right, as they went from here through the Lich Gate.
Into the churchyard,
yeah.
Were you very moved that day?
Yes, I was. Yes, I was.
I bet you were, actually.
It was the most beautiful day, beautiful, beautiful, ice-cold day. And he was committed, with his whole family standing around him. And as the coffin was lowered into the grave, a Spitfire flew right over his head. I've never forgotten that.
So the journey that had taken him all over the world ended in an English country churchyard. There's no grand monument, no eternal flame, no ringing declaration, just a stone slab inscribed with his name and that of his wife, who joined him a few years later.
On that icy January day back in 1965, more than 1 million people lined the London streets to honour the passing of a man who had stood firm when others might have buckled. He was just a human, mortal and fallible like the rest of us. But the people had seen in his spirit something they hoped to see in themselves.
History isn't made by great men, but sometimes a man or woman may so come to express the spirit of the age that they become great. Winston Churchill was such a figure. He looked a bit like a bulldog, and when the nation needed it, he expressed the determination of a bulldog. Sure, he was a chancer, an egotist, a workaholic, and sometimes a bit of a charlatan. But in this age of political miniatures, there is no one who can hold a candle to him. For the sake of the nation, we must hope that the old cliche about never seeing his like again isn't true, because one day we may need his like. But in the 50 years since his death, there has been no sign of such a figure.